Hello everyone. Today our audiobook is about Indian Polity by M. Laxmikanth, 6th edition. As we begin with the first part, it is Constitutional Framework. It contains 11 chapters, that is, historical background, making of the Constitution, salient features of the Constitution, preamble of the Constitution, Union and its territory, citizenship, fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, fundamental duties, amendment of the Constitution, basic structure of the Constitution. As we start with the first chapter of Laxmikanth, that is, historical background. The British came to India in 1600 as traders in the form of East India Company, which had the exclusive right of trading in India under a charter granted by Queen Elizabeth I. In 1765, the company, which till now had purely trading functions, obtained the Diwani, that is, rights over revenue and civil justice of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This started its career as a territorial power. In 1858, in the wake of Sepoy Mutiny, the British Crown assumed direct responsibility for the governance of India. This rule continued until India was granted independence on August 15, 1947. With independence came the need for a constitution, hence a constituent assembly was formed for this purpose. In 1946, on January 26, 1950, the constitution came into being. However, various features of Indian constitution and polity have their roots in British rule. There were certain events in British rule that laid the legal framework for the organization and functioning of government and administration in British India. These events have greatly influenced our constitution and polity. They are explained here in a chronological order under two major headings. First, the Company Rule 1773 to 1858. Second, the Crown Rule 1858 to 1947. The Company Rule 1773 to 1858, Regulating Act of 1773. This act was great constitutional importance as a. It was the first step taken by the British government to control and regulate the affairs of East India Company in India. B. It recognized for the first time the political, administrative functions of the company, and it laid the foundations of central administration in India. The feature of this act were as follows. It designated the Governor General as the Governor General of Bengal and created an executive council of 4 members to assist him. The first Governor General was Lord Warren Hastings. It made the Governor of Bengal and Madras presidencies subordinate to the Governor General of Bengal, unlike earlier, when the 3 presidencies were independent of one another. It provided for the establishment of Supreme Court at Kolkata, 1774, comprising 1 Chief Justice and 3 other judges. It prohibited the servants of the company from engaging in any private trade or accepting presents or bribe from the natives. It strengthened the control of British government over the company by requiring the Court of Directors, governing body of the company, to report on its revenue, civil and military affairs in India. Amending Act of 1781. In a bid to rectify the defects of Regulating Act of 1773, the British Parliament passed the Amending Act of 1781, also known as the Act of Settlement. The feature of these acts were as follows. It exempted the Governor General and the Council from jurisdiction of Supreme Court for the acts done by them in their official capacity. Similarly, it also exempted the servants of the company from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for their official action. It excluded the revenue matters and the matters arising in collection of revenues from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It provided that Supreme Court was to have jurisdiction over all the inhabitants of Kolkata. It also required the court to administer the personal law of the defendants, that is, Hindus were to be tried according to Hindu law and Muslims were to be tried according to Mohammedan law. It laid down that appeals from the provincial court could be taken to Governor General in Council and not to Supreme Court. It empowered Governor General in Council to frame regulation for provincial and court councils. Pitt's India Act of 1784. The next important act was Pitt's India Act of 1784. The features of this act were as follows. It distinguished between the commercial and political functions of the company. It allowed the Court of Directors to manage the commercial affairs, but created a new body called Board of Control to manage the political affairs. Thus is established a system of double government. It empowered Board of Control to supervise and direct all operations of civil and military government or revenues of the British possessions in India. Thus, the act was significant for two reasons. First, the company's territory in India were for the first time called British possessions in India. And second, the British government was given the supreme control over the company's affair and its administration in India. Act of 1786. In 1786, Lord Cornwallis was appointed as Governor General of Bengal. He placed two demands to accept that post, which he should be given power to override the decision of his council in special cases. He would also be given the Commander-in-Chief title. According to the Act of 1786 was enacted to make both the provisions. Charter Act of 1793. The feature of this act were as follows. It extended the overriding power given to Lord Cornwallis over his council to all future governor-generals and governors of presidencies. It gave the governor-general more powers and control over the governments of subordinate presidencies of Bombay and Madras. It extended the trade monopoly of the company in India for another period of 20 years. It provided that the Commander-in-Chief was not to be the member of Governor-General Council unless he was so appointed. It laid down that the members of Board of Control and their staff were henceforth to be paid out of the Indian revenues. Charter Act of 1813. The features of these acts were as follows. It abolished the trade monopoly of company in India, that is, the Indian trade was thrown open to all British merchants. However, it continued the monopoly of the company over the trade in tea and trade with China. It asserted the sovereignty of British Crown over the company's territories in India. It allowed Christian missionaries to come to India for the purpose of enlightening the people. It provided for the spread of Western education among the inhabitants of British territories in India. It authorized the local governments in India to impose taxes on persons. They could also punish the person for not paying taxes. Charter Act of 1833. This act was the final step towards the centralization of British India. The feature of this act were as follows. It made the Governor General of Bengal as the Governor General of India and vested in him all civil and military powers. Thus the act created for the first time Government of India having authority over the entire territorial area possessed by British in India. Lord William Bentinck was the first Governor General of India. It deprived the Governor of Bengal and Madras of their legislative powers. The Governor General of India was given exclusive legislative powers for the entire British India. The laws made under the previous acts were called as regulations, while the laws under this act were called as acts. It ended the activities of East India Company as the commercial body, which became a purely administrative body. It provided that the company's territories in India were held by it in the trust for His Majesty, his heirs and successors. The Charter Act of 1833 attempted to introduce a system of open competition for selection of civil servants and stated that Indians should not be debarred from holding any place, office, and employment under the company. However, this provision was neglected after opposition from the Code of Directors. Charter Act of 1853. This was the last of the series of Charter Acts passed by the British Parliament between 1793 and 1853. It was a significant constitutional landmark. The features of these acts were as follows. It separated for the first time the legislative and executive functions of the Governor General's Council. It provided for the addition of 6 new members called legislative councillors to the council. In other words, it established a separate Governor General's Legislative Council, which came to be known as Indian Central Legislative Council. This legislative wing of the council functions as the mini parliament, adopting the same procedures as the British Parliament. Thus, legislation for the first time was treated as the special function of the government, requiring special machinery and special process. It introduced an open competition system of selection and recruitment of civil servants. The covenanted civil service was thus thrown open to Indians also. According to Macaulay Committee, the Committee on Indian Civil Service was appointed in 1854. It extended the company's rule and allowed it to retain the possession of Indian territories on trust of British Crown. But it does not specify any particular period. Unlike the previous charters, this was a clear indication that company's rule could be terminated at any time the Parliament liked. It introduced for the first time local representation in Indian Central Legislative Council of 6 new legislative members of Governor General's Council. 4 members were appointed by the local provincial government of Madras, Bombay, Bengal and Agra.